Over the course of this channel, I've covered some of the most fascinating places on this normal planet. However, I'm going to take a temporary pause on covering planet Earth to look at another world, the World of Warcraft, specifically the fictional planet of Azeroth. This fictional world has incredibly detailed geographic lore, many of which are heavily inspired not only by elements of fantasy, but also elements of the real world's geography. And while I'm fully aware that there will be some smartasses telling me that geography specifically refers to the study of Earth, I'm using the word geography in a more flexible sense. It could be applied to the physical landscape of any planet, real or fictional. So I suppose you could call it planetary science, but then again, this is a fantasy game, and I doubt arcane magic is particularly scientific. Anyway, let's look at the big picture. The planet of Azeroth, as seen in the game of the World of Warcraft, is at a far smaller scale than that of our own world. If you convert the pixels into square kilometers or square miles, the area you can explore in the original game is smaller than New York City. Now obviously the game has to scale down the size of the planet for the purposes of game mechanics and user interface. If you had to wait 4 months in the game to travel on a boat to a new continent, no one would have the time to play the game. And hell, even with the toned down scale, some gamers still have trouble getting a life outside of the World of Warcraft. But putting neckbeards LARPing as heroes aside, the unofficial RPG of the game, which is not canon, describes a world at a far larger scale, due to their population numbers of each town of the region. For this reason, it might be better to view the playable World of Warcraft as a simulacrum, a scaled-down version of the world mentioned in the lore, and many of the books, comics, and other forms of media. Moving on from the scale, let's get to the climatology of Azeroth. In some ways it matches our world, but in other ways it just kind of disregards it. For example, the northern continent is Northrend, which for the most part has a frigid climate, similar to those of the polar regions of Earth. However, most of the southern parts of the known world are composed of deserts and jungles. In our world, jungles, coral reefs tend to straddle the equator, whereas deserts and savannas tend to form rings around the north and south of the equator around the subtropics, and then south and north of those rings are the temperate regions, with grasslands and temperate forests. And then above those two rings you have boreal forests and then tundra. And then at the poles you have a frigid Arctic and Antarctic climate. This conundrum in the World of Warcraft has led some to speculate that what we see on the map is really just the northern hemisphere. The most southern zone of the eastern kingdoms is a tropical rainforest, the Stranglethorn Vale, something you're unlikely to find in Antarctica. The game developers have yet to provide a clear explanation for this. Maybe they're planning on introducing a Southern Hemisphere in a future expansion, or maybe they just failed 6th grade social studies class. And besides, are we really going to make a big deal about the physical geography on a planet with goblins and undead? Now, I'm not going to go over every single zone in the game, but rather the zones that are clearly inspired by real-world places on Earth. For this reason, I'm not going to be covering some of the more fantastical zones with undead blight or forests made out of crystal trees, as I'm pretty sure they don't exist on Earth, at least on the times I don't drop acid. Let's first start off with the continent of Northrend. This place clearly has the climate and geography similar to most northern temperate regions of the world, as well as the polar and subpolar regions of planet Earth that you'd see across much of Alaska, Canada, Scandinavia, and Siberia. In this region, you'll see plenty of tundra, as well as taiga, which I'm mispronouncing, a Russian word referring to boreal forests, winter forests, that you clearly see in the game as well. So let's start off with the Howling Fjord. Now, a fjord is a Norwegian word that refers to a large inlet that was once covered under a giant glacier, which pushed the soil and rock below it down. When the Earth's climate warmed up, many of these glaciers partially melted, leading to these epic ocean inlets where mountains meet seas. This can be found in Alaska, British Columbia and Canada, Chile, and New Zealand. The Norwegian coast has tons of fjords, an epic landscape for an epic people, the Norsemen. It's no surprise that the race native to this fictional land called the Howling Fjord are based off of the Vikings, namely the mountain giants in Norse mythology. This can be seen in much of their architecture as well. However, this isn't the only part of the continent that is clearly reminiscent of taiga forests. You also have the Grizzly Hills as you move northwestward. Now, while the Howling Fjord was more reminiscent of the sort of boreal forest that you'd see in Scandinavia, I would say that the Grizzly Hills is more reminiscent of North America, such as the US state of Alaska or the Canadian territory of the Yukon. These regions have some of the highest concentrations of grizzly bears in the world, and hence you got the Grizzly Hills. Keep in mind that these boreal forests are primarily made up of coniferous forests with pine trees that don't drop their leaves during the fall. Speaking of boreal, the next zone on the list is the boreal tundra, which is a little bit of a misnomer because boreal forests and tundra are two different biomes. Tundra doesn't have a lot of trees. In fact, it's kind of like a frozen wasteland with permafrost. Tundra also tends to be flat and far more frigid than a boreal forest, only suitable for small shrubs and bushes. The race of walrus people known as the Tuskar here are native to the land, and they have a culture that is clearly based off of the Inuit peoples of the Canadian territory of Nunavut. It is not a surprise that much of the action of this zone happens on the shores, as that's the only part of the zone with a decent food source. The rest of it is pretty much a frozen wasteland. It's also worth noting that there's a zone in Northrend called the Shalazar Basin, which is actually a jungle, which the game developers clearly added to take a break from the Frozen theme. Now, this would obviously never exist in our world, but the game developers said, hey, it's magical and there's Titan forces, making it a lot warmer and lusher than your typical Arctic environment. And hey, you can do that, because after all, it's make-believe. Let's move on to the Eastern Kingdoms. The Eastern Kingdoms is really two continents that are sandwiched together, divided into 3 regions, or perhaps 4 regions. But hey, continents in our real world don't make much sense either. Like, why is Europe its own continent? It's really Eurasia. Anyway, the Eastern Kingdoms is a bit of a misnomer because kingdoms implies some sort of political boundary, whereas these have more physical geographic boundaries and barriers. It's worth pointing out that the first area shown in the game of Warcraft 1 was called the Land of Azeroth, which refers to the southern quarter of the continent. However, it eventually became the name of the entire planet as a whole. This is quite similar to the way that many people groups have changed the meaning of the real world over time. A small, known world can expand into a bigger, known world the more you learn about it. Just take a look at how the maps of the known world were according to the Greeks. And just like the Greeks, the game developers at Blizzard have divided the world into different sections. And the Eastern Kingdoms are divided into 4 sections, the most northern of which is known as Quel'Thalas, which is the lost home of the Blood Elves. This area is by and large the most fantastical of all. This is followed by Lordaeron, an area that was once home to many human kingdoms but has been by and large taken over by the undead throughout much of the game's history. And then there are heavily mountainous regions just south of that called Cosmodon, home of the dwarves. And then finally, there is the southern quarter known as Azeroth, which confusingly again shares the same name as the planet. And this is where modern human activity by and large happens in as far as the World of Warcraft is concerned. If you go to the top quarter of this continent in Quel'Thalas, here you see the most fantastical elements. I'm not going to dwell too much on this region because by and large there aren't too many real world parallels. And what does exist is minor. For example, the forests of Eversong by and large look like they're in a perpetual state of autumn, with orange, red, and yellow leaves. They also have white bark, which I think is typical of eucalyptus trees, but this area clearly is not inspired by Australia. As you move southward away from the areas with all the pretty stuff, you get to undead lands like the Plague Lands. These areas are haunted and filled with parasitic diseases. It's worth pointing out that again, this is by and large inspired by a temperate climate, but the undead elements are obviously fantastical. When you remove these fantastical elements, you get a biome that is clearly temperate, made up of usually coniferous or deciduous forests. This is not uncommon in fantasy games, as lands that are inhabited by humans or by elves or dwarves or creatures similar to humans, by and large, like to prefer temperate climates. I suppose the primary reason for this is that many of these franchises were based in Europe or North America, which have temperate climates themselves, and many people were creating environments that were similar to their own. I'd like to think that if the genre of modern fantasy developed in, say, the Arab world, then the environment of the starting race of humans would probably be in a desert. Or perhaps if Indonesians had created this genre, then perhaps the starting zones for humans and their allies would be in jungles. One zone where European, and in particular, British influence can be greatly seen is in the Arathi Highlands. The Arathi Highlands are quite reminiscent of pre-Roman Britain, and even perhaps pre-Celtic Britain, a time before Indo-Europeans arrived in the British Isles. You can see this with structures that are clearly inspired by Stonehenge, as well as others that we don't really know the purpose of, but clearly have been created by intelligent beings far in the past. We know very little about pre-Celtic cultures of the British Isles, and this adds a sense of mystery of the land surrounding the structures both in the real world and in the Arathi Highlands. The game developers designed this area clearly know a thing or two about history. After all, the Arathi Highlands were the home of the first human kingdom, and since the humans in the World of Warcraft are inspired by medieval England, it made sense to make the origin story of the first kingdom of humans to be set in a place that was reminiscent of pre-Celtic Britain. So I'm going to move away from Lordaeron and head southward to Cosmodon, the home of the dwarves. The dwarves in World of Warcraft are clearly inspired by the dwarves of the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien, the writer of Lord of the Rings, who in turn was clearly inspired by Germanic mythology and folklore, namely that of Norse mythology, of which the dwarves take a significant role in. This region of Cosmodon is very high in elevation for the most part, with the dwarven kingdom of Ironforge being the center of their kingdom, lodged into the mountains. And this area is pretty much covered in snow-capped peaks, followed by another region at a lower elevation, called Loch Modan. It's called Loch Modan because Loch means lake, and it just so happens to have had a giant lake in the middle of the zone before the events of Cataclysm. This area is quite reminiscent of the Scottish Highlands and the lochs or lakes that exist there. After all, most of you have probably heard of the Loch Ness Monster, and it's not a surprise that the dwarves in this fictional world have Scottish accents. The lake used to actually have a dam, as it was somewhat of a reservoir. However, after the events of Cataclysm, this dam pretty much erupted, emptying much of the lake and flooding the wetlands, which is the lowest elevated region of Cosmodon. This area is by and large composed of flat wetlands, similar to what you'd see in Florida. Although I'm still trying to figure out why the crocodiles in the game have 6 legs. Can someone tell me that? Anyway, like southern Florida, the wetlands are home to incredibly rich biodiversity. However, they're also prone to flooding, and they're not particularly suitable for human habitation unless you drain those said wetlands. On the other side of Cosmodon, you get a region that is very, very different from the wetlands, the Badlands. While much of the moisture and melted glacier water flows to the north, the south is far drier. The Badlands are reminiscent of the Grand Canyon and much of the southwestern United States. This area is inhospitable for any major civilization. However, it does have some beautiful scenic vistas out there reminiscent of what you'd see in Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and northern Mexico. Fun fact, there actually is a Badlands National Park found in South Dakota, which is not in the Southwest, but is clearly a bad land with terrible precipitation and not particularly livable. Great for doing a hike, but not perhaps for living in there. And the same thing goes with the Badlands of the World of Warcraft. Now, the term Badland doesn't refer to any sort of evil demonic entities, but rather just a place that is terrible for human life. Hence why South Dakota probably has a population of maybe 21 people. Now let's move on to the final portion of the Eastern Kingdoms and the most southern portion, and really the portion that really defined the entire game, Azeroth. Now, as stated before, back in Warcraft 1, Azeroth was the name of the entire known world. And then as the game expanded into different regions, Azeroth became the name of the planet as well as the region, which is a little bit confusing and could be seen as either A, poor writing, or B, the writers acknowledging how human beings actually define their place in the world. For example, many First Nations indigenous people of North America refer to their land as Turtle Island. This could have been used to refer to their immediate surroundings. Those who had more trade networks probably used it to refer to the entire North American continent as far as they knew about it. And some may even have proposed that Turtle Island was the entire world. Today, with our knowledge of the entire world, many Native Americans and First Nations refer to the entire planet as the World Turtle or Turtle Island, while others just claim it's North America. I'm pretty sure the game developers at Blizzard know about this concept because in a future expansion, they literally added a zone on the back of a turtle. And I'll get to that when I cover Pandaria in the next episode on Warcraft Isles. Now, it's worth pointing out that in between Azeroth and Khazmodon is an area of volcanic activity known as the Searing Gorge and the Burning Steppes. However, unlike our world where volcanoes are the result of seismic activity, these are the result of magic and the folly of mere mortals. These two zones actually have some of the highest level counts in the game, and that's quite a common trope in video games. Oftentimes volcanic areas and areas with lava by and large tend to exude a sense of physical danger and fear, and by and large are used for more advanced players. And you see this from everything from World of Warcraft to Bowser's Castle and the Mario video games. After all, Bowser's Castle is filled with lava. Moving south, we get to the parts of Azeroth where most of the action happens. Here we have the beloved Elwynn Forest, the human starting zone with the human capital, Stormwind, which is the most important urban center in the region, and arguably the most important urban center on the planet. This is kind of like the New York City of Azeroth. However, it's clearly not reminiscent of modern-day New York City, but rather a medieval European city, particularly those of England. Elwynn Forest is quite reminiscent of some of the deciduous forests that you would see in Northern Europe and the Eastern United States. These forests, by and large, have a sense of familiarity among many Westerners, as they're the type of forests that you'd probably see in your typical city park, or perhaps nearby national park if you're living in one of those regions. Everything from the ambience, the type of trees and bushes, the good visibility, the friendly locals in this region give you a sense that this region of Elwynn Forest poses no danger, similar to a walk in the park. The blue skies and easy access to water make this area suited for a sort of beginner level sense of ambience, a sort of place that you feel home in. And this region has probably produced more nostalgia than any other in the World of Warcraft, with the possible exception of the Barrens, which I'll get into in my Kalimdor episode. As the player reaches level 10 or beyond, they will have to go to another zone, one that also seems fairly familiar but not as pretty, and that's Westfall. Westfall lies to the west of Elwynn Forest, and it's clearly a very agrarian zone, reminiscent of perhaps the American Midwest or the Central European Plain. These regions are temperate in their climate and have very rich soil and are fantastic for farming high-yielding crops. As a result, they have become breadbaskets of their respective continents. A state like Iowa produces an exceptional amount of corn for much of North America, and Ukraine produces an exceptional amount of wheat for much of Europe, the Middle East, and other parts of the world. Likewise, Westfall plays a pivotal role in providing food for the fictional world of Azeroth, or at the very least, the Kingdom of Stormwind. And like most breadbaskets, the land here is very flat, as flat land is very good for farming due to the efficiency of plowing the fields. It kind of gives you this little house on the prairie or Charlotte's Web vibe to it. Now there's another zone that is part of the Kingdom of Stormwind that also has this sort of happy-go-lucky feel, and that is the Red Ridge Mountains. That doesn't necessarily fit into any specific geography I could think of, however it does share a temperate climate like its nearby zones, and it kind of looks like Elwyn Forest, just a little bit more mountainous, a giant lake in the middle, and it's kind of in a state of perpetual autumn. Nearby is another region or zone called the Swamp of Sorrows. This area is clearly, well, a swamp, and it does produce a lot of sorrows for the gameplay. I mean, it was probably one of the worst zones in the game. Now, the word swamp has a negative connotation in our culture, not because swamps are necessarily bad. If anything, they're incredibly biodiverse and very important ecologically. But given that you have a lot of still fresh water, it makes these regions home to a lot of mosquitoes, which spread malaria among other diseases. As a result, the word swamp, again, has a negative connotation in our culture, and this is why ecologists and conservationists tend to prefer to use the term wetlands. And it's not a surprise that the zone wetlands in World of Warcraft looks a lot more pleasant than the Swamp of Sorrows. But then again, I don't really care about the conservation of fictional, pixelated, six-legged crocodilians. I care a lot more about the next zone on our list, and perhaps my favorite zone in the entire game, the Stranglethorn Vale. Or if you're talking about post-Cataclysm, it's actually two zones, Northern Stranglethorn and Cape Stranglethorn. The zone was so awesome they had to split it in two. This area is composed of very dense foliage and has a lot of biodiversity when it comes to flora and fauna. It's kind of just like our real rainforests on Earth, except for the jungle trolls and the magic voodoo stuff. Like rainforests and jungles of our world, this zone tends to elude a sense of danger, curiosity, fascination, and fear. This has very difficult terrain, similar to the rainforests, again, of planet Earth. And it's not a surprise that this area also had some of the most heavy PvP combat. After all, in the real world, jungles tend to be very conducive for guerrilla warfare. Just watch any movie about the Vietnam War. However, I'd say that the jungles of Stranglethorn are more reminiscent of the jungles of Central America. The main reason for this is that the architecture left by the indigenous people, the jungle trolls, is far more reminiscent of Mesoamerican civilization, namely the Mayans. You can see this in their archways, their step pyramids, and their walls. For this reason, I'd probably say that Stranglethorn Vale is most heavily inspired by the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, along with much of Central America like Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. Now, as you move south, you get to the Cape of Stranglethorn. A cape is basically a long, pointy geographic feature that juts out into the ocean, the most famous example of which is the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. It is very close to being the most southern point of the African continent, but its hook shape makes it particularly more iconic than the actual southern point of the continent. South America also has a pretty impressive cape. However, unlike Cape Horn or the Cape of Good Hope, the Cape of Stranglethorn has a tropical climate. It also has amazing natural harbors and a little island protecting it from the waves. Well, partially protecting it. This harbor is home to Booty Bay, one of my personal favorite towns in the entire World of Warcraft. This area tends to have a pretty big pirate theme that is quite reminiscent of the golden age of piracy during the 1700s on Earth, with legends of Blackbeard and other infamous pirates of the Caribbean. And it's not a surprise that much of the environment here is not too far off than what you'd see in Caribbean cities at the time, such as Kingston, Jamaica, or Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. The indigenous peoples of this land are the trolls, who have Jamaican accents, and their religion is quite similar to Haitian voodoo. And it's not a surprise that they are in a place that pretty much has a strong Caribbean theme overall, as reminiscent of their architecture. There's also a strong goblin presence, and the goblins tend to be more like, say, European colonists who set up a camp along these Caribbean islands. I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to make a political statement here. These are just parallels that I see with the real world. And so I'll end this video off with the coolest place to be in Azeroth, both the region and the planet. In my next video, we're going to be going over the lore of Kalimdor. Thanks for watching.